The practice room was Elena Chun's favorite place in the whole world. It wasn't much to look at, just a small, square box with plain white walls, an old but decent upright piano, and a single window high up that showed only a slice of gray sky. But it was soundproof. For one precious hour, booked days in advance on the Hartwell Conservatory's competitive online system, the noisy, judgmental world outside ceased to exist. At 17, Elena felt most real when her fingers were on the keys. The rest of life was a checklist: perfect grades, respectful daughter, quiet friend. Here, she could be loud, or soft, or messy. In theory, anyway. Today, the pressure was a physical weight on her shoulders. The Regional Young Artists Competition was in 3 days. Her assigned piece, Shostakovich's Prelude in D-flat major, was a storm of technical challenges, rapid, chattering notes that demanded iron control and lightning-fast jumps across the keyboard. It was supposed to sound playful, like a sly joke, but right now, under her hands, it just sounded frantic. She played the same difficult run for the 10th time. Her 4th finger stumbled on the same black key. Again, stupid, she muttered to the empty room. She pulled her hands back into her lap, flexing her aching fingers. The metronome on the piano ticked away with a robotic, unsympathetic click-click-click. It matched the rhythm of her anxiety perfectly. The ghost of her last lesson with Professor Lint hovered in the air. Asterisk. It is correct, Elena, but it is empty. Where is the wit? Where is the life? You must not be a typewriter. Be a storyteller. Asterisk. But how did you tell a story you didn't understand? The music felt like a complex puzzle in a language she hadn't mastered. She sighed, a deep sound that got lost in the quiet. Almost without thinking, her hands drifted back to the keys. But they didn't return to Shostakovich. They found a different home. They settled into a sequence of notes that were simple, gentle, and sad. This was her secret song. She'd learned it not from a conservatory professor, but from her grandmother, Ninai, during a summer visit to Shanghai. Ninai wasn't a concert pianist. She was a retired school music teacher with gnarled, gentle hands. One rainy afternoon, she'd sat at her old, slightly out-of-tune piano and played this melody. It wasn't written down. It was a memory. A friend sent this to me a long time ago, Ninai had said, her eyes looking at something far away. A very kind woman from America. She said it was a lullaby for grown-ups, for when the world is too loud. Elena had begged to learn it. It wasn't flashy. It didn't have a famous composer's name attached. But it spoke. It felt like a quiet room in a busy house. Like a hand on your shoulder when you were sad. Her fingers remembered the shape of it now, the slow, descending bass line like a sigh, the right-hand melody curling around it like a question dot. As she played, the tight knot in her chest began to loosen. The rigid, correct posture she maintained for Shostakovich softened. She leaned into the piano, letting the sustain pedal blend the notes into a soft, watery haze. For 2 minutes, she wasn't a competitor. She wasn't a student trying to be perfect. She was just a girl, playing a song that felt like a hug from her grandmother. The last note faded into a beautiful silence, and she just sat there, feeling its echo. Thump. A sudden, sharp sound against the door made her jump. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Before she could even say, "Come in," the door swung open. The man who filled the doorway seemed to suck all the air and warmth out of the small room. It was Judge Alistair Finch. Everyone at Hartwell knew him. He wasn't just a teacher. He was an institution. A former concert pianist of legendary skill and even more legendary sternness. His critiques in master classes were the stuff of terrified student gossip. He could dismantle a performance with a single, perfectly chosen ice-cold word. Right now, his sharp blue eyes swept over her, and the piano as if he'd found something distasteful he needed to remove. Elena's body snapped back to perfect posture, her hands freezing in her lap. "Time is up," he said. His voice wasn't loud, but it was like a sheet of glass breaking clear, sharp, and final. She instinctively glanced at the clock on the wall. The big red digital numbers glowed back. She had 7 minutes left. "I'm sorry, sir. The schedule says I have until the hour." The schedule," he interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument, "is a guideline. Your rehearsal has been audible in the hall for the last 5 minutes. These rooms are soundproof, not magic." He took a step inside, his imposing frame making the room feel even smaller. "And what I heard was sufficient." A hot flush of embarrassment crept up Elena's neck. She'd been playing her grandmother's song softly. She was sure of it. But maybe the pedal, or the old piano. "You were working on the Shostakovich?" he asked, though it sounded more like an accusation. Yes, sir." "For the competition?" He gave a short, dismissive nod. "I thought so." "It's all wrong." The words were a physical slap. Elena felt her face go hot. "The notes are there. Technically, it's adequate," he continued, as if adequate was a filthy word. "But it is completely mechanical. You play like a very expensive player piano. Where is the character? The slyness? The life?" He shook his head, a gesture of profound disappointment that was worse than anger. "You cannot just press the correct keys in the correct order and call it music. That is data entry." Tears pricked sharply behind Elena's eyes. She blinked furiously, looking down at her hands. She willed them not to tremble. "This room," Judge Finch said, his gaze sweeping the space once more, "is for musicians. For artists who have something to say. Not for robots who have something to type." He paused, letting the cruel metaphor hang in the air between them. "Clear out. Someone else may actually benefit from this time." Then he turned and left, pulling the door shut behind him with a firm, definitive click. The silence he left behind was different from before. It wasn't peaceful. It was humiliated. It was heavy. Elena sat completely still for a long moment, the echo of his words ringing louder than any note. Asterisk robot, data entry. Not a musician. Asterisk each one landed like a stone in her stomach. The beautiful, safe feeling from her grandmother's song was utterly gone, crushed under the weight of his judgment. A slow fire began to replace the cold shock. It started as a tiny spark of anger deep in her gut. It wasn't just that he was harsh. It was that he hadn't even heard her. He'd heard a few bars of a piece he expected to add, and he'd made up his mind. He'd dismissed her entire hour, her effort, her dream, in 30 seconds. Her eyes, now dry and hot, fixed on the sheet music for the Shostakovich. The black notes on the page seemed to swim, taunting her. "You'll never get it," they seemed to whisper. He's right. With a sudden, forceful movement, she snatched the pages off the music stand. She shoved them, along with her notebook, into her bag. The movement was jerky, fueled by a raw mix of hurt and defiance. She stood up, the legs of the piano bench scraping the floor with a jarring sound. She slung her bag over her shoulder, the weight of it pulling at her. As she reached for the doorknob, she paused. She looked back at the silent, black and white keys. Judge Finch thought she had nothing to say. He thought her music was empty. For a fleeting second, the haunting, simple melody of her grandmother's lullaby drifted through her mind. That was a real feeling. That was a story. Not the clever, complicated puzzle of Shostakovich. She opened the door and stepped into the bright, noisy hallway, the echo of the judge's words still chasing her. But underneath the hurt, that small, defiant spark still glowed. It was faint, but it was there. The main audition hall of the Hartwell Conservatory was nothing like the little practice room. It was huge, with a high vaulted ceiling that made every sound feel important and a little scary. Rows of empty, velvet-seated chairs stretched back into a dark gloom. The stage was wide and brightly lit, and sitting in the middle of it, the grand piano looked like a giant, sleeping black creature. Elena waited in the wings, her stomach doing slow, nervous somersaults. She could hear the pianist before her finishing their piece, a furious, impressive cascade of notes from a Prokofiev sonata. It sounded like a thunderstorm. The audience, made up of other competitors and a few teachers, broke into polite, measured applause. She peeked around the heavy velvet curtain. At a long table down in the front row sat the three judges. On the right was Professor Lint, her own teacher, who gave her a small, tight smile that was meant to be encouraging, but just looked worried. In the middle was Mrs. Alvarez, the head of the piano department, her face calm and unreadable. And on the left, sitting perfectly straight, his silver hair catching the light, was Judge Alistair Finch. He looked even more severe under the formal lights. He didn't clap. He simply made a quick note on the paper in front of him with a sleek silver pen, his expression never changing. He was a statue of judgment, not the competitor. A tall boy from the year above her walked off stage. He passed Elena, his face pale, muttering good luck under his breath without really looking at her. Elena Chun. A voice called from the stage manager. This was it. Her legs felt like they were made of wood as she walked out into the blinding pool of light. The polite applause sounded like distant rain. She gave a stiff little bow toward the judge's table, avoiding looking directly at any of them, and settled onto the piano bench. The seat felt unfamiliar, the piano vast and imposing. She arranged her sheet music for the Shostakovich, the pages crisp and official. She took a deep, shaky breath, placed her hands in her lap, then lifted them to the keys. And then she played Dot. It was, technically, the best she had ever played the piece. Every note was in its right place. Every rhythm was precise. Her fingers flew over the tricky runs. They nailed the jumps. She remembered every single marking on the page, every fort, every piano, every staccato. She played it exactly as written. She played it like a robot Dot as her fingers moved automatically. A part of her mind split off and watched from a distance. She saw Judge Finch. He was not writing. He had set his pen down. He was just listening, his chin resting on his steepled fingers, his eyes fixed on her. There was no anger on his face, no impatience. There was nothing. It was a blank, terrible neutrality. It was worse than his scowl in the practice room. This was the look of someone who had heard exactly what he expected to hear, and was no longer even interested. Her heart, which had been pounding, began to sink. It felt like it was dropping right through the bench and down into some dark space under the stage. The music kept flowing from her hands, but it was hollow. It was data entry. He had been right. The final, sharp chords of the Shostakovich rang out. She held the position for a second, then let her hands fall. There was a beat of silence, then the same polite patter of applause. It sounded weak in the big hall. Empty Dot, it was over. She had done it. She had played perfectly, and it meant nothing. The weight of it crushed her. All the months of work, the hours in the practice room, the hope she'd carried, it all dissolved into that weak applause. She saw Judge Finch pick up his pen again, ready to write his final note, to assign her a number that would seal her fate. Professor Lint was nodding slowly, a sad understanding in her eyes. It was done. A terrible, quiet despair washed over Elena. This was the end. She would walk off, and he would write, adequate or technically proficient, or lack soul, and that would be the story of her competition. But then, from that deep place of despair, something else stirred. It wasn't anger this time. It was a sudden, startling clarity. A voice in her head that didn't sound like her own anxious one. It sounded, strangely, like her grandmother's. Gentle but firm. Asterisk. Play your song, little one. The one that matters. Asterisk, if this was the end, if she had already failed, then what was left to lose? The rules said one piece. The judges expected you to leave. But no one had physically stopped her yet. Her heart began to hammer again, but for a different reason. Not from fear, but from a wild, reckless pulse of defiance. It was a quiet defiance. It wasn't about showing off. It was about being seen. Really seen. Just once, instead of standing up to bow, she took a long, slow breath. She turned her body back to face the piano. She gently closed the binder holding the Shostakovich and pushed it to the far side of the music stand. A faint ripple of confusion went through the hall. She heard a soft cough. She saw, from the corner of her eye, Mrs. Alvarez lean forward slightly. Professor Lint's eyes went wide with alarm. Judge Finch looked up from his paper. A faint line appeared between his eyebrows. Not anger yet, puzzlement. Who was this student disobeying protocol? Elena didn't look at them. She looked at the black and white keys. They were no longer a test. They were a door. She placed her hand softly on the cool ivory. She closed her eyes for a brief second, picturing her grandmother's living room, the smell of tea, the sound of rain against the window, and then she began to play. The first few notes of her grandmother's lullaby fell into the quiet hall. They were so different from the Shostakovich. They were slow, simple. They didn't shout. They whispered. They weren't trying to impress anyone. They were just true. She played from memory, her body swaying slightly with the gentle rocking rhythm of the bass. All the technical stiffness was gone. Her shoulders dropped. Her face, which had been a mask of concentration, softened. She wasn't thinking about her fingers. She was thinking about the feeling, the loneliness the song held, and the comfort it offered anyway. She poured all the disappointment of the day, all the longing to be understood, into those tender phrases. The hall was utterly, profoundly silent. It wasn't the silence of boredom. It was the silence of held breath. She risked a glance. Professor Lint was frozen, her hand over her mouth. Mrs. Alvarez was watching intently, her head tilted, and Judge Finch. Judge Finch was not moving. The silver pen had slipped from his fingers and rolled across the table, coming to a stop against his water glass with a tiny clink that sounded huge in the quiet. He made no move to retrieve it. All the color had drained from his face. He looked as if someone had reached inside his chest and squeezed his heart. His stern, composed mask was completely gone, shattered. His eyes, those sharp, judging blue eyes, were wide. They were fixed on her hands, but they weren't seeing the present. They were seeing a ghost. They were glistening with a sheen of pure, unguarded shock. He didn't look angry. He didn't look confused anymore. He looked utterly, completely shattered. Elena kept playing, the melody unfolding like a secret being told for the first time in decades. She saw his lips part slightly, as if he wanted to speak, but no sound came out. He was a statue again, but not of judgment, of memory, of pain. The last section of the lullaby rose, a small, hopeful question in the melody, before fading away on two low, resonant chords. Elena let the sound hang in the air until it was absorbed completely by the silence. She slowly lowered her hands to her lap. For a long moment, nothing happened. The hall was a vacuumed out then. The sound of a chair scraping, harsh and loud, tore through the quiet. Judge Finch was standing. He was unsteady, racing his hands on the table. The other judges looked up at him, astonished. His voice, when it finally came, was not the cold, clear instrument from the practice room. It was a dry, cracked whisper, but in the silent hall, every word carried. Where? He began and had to stop. He swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing. Where did you learn that? The question wasn't a judge's question. It was a plea. It was the voice of a lost man who had just heard a song from a world he thought was gone forever. Everyone in the room turned from him to look at her, waiting for the answer. The silence in the hall was so thick you could feel it pressing against your skin. It wasn't the quiet after a performance, where people are getting ready to clap. This was the silence of a held breath, of a shared dream. Every eye was fixed on the old judge standing at the table, and the young girl sitting at the piano. Elena's own heart was beating a wild, frantic rhythm against her ribs. The defiant courage that had pushed her to play the song was gone, evaporated the moment Judge Finch spoke. Now she just felt exposed, and deeply confused. She had expected anger, a cutting remark about her disrespect. She had not expected this raw, shattered look on his face, this whispered question that sounded like it hurt him to ask. I? Her voice came out as a squeak. She cleared her throat, her fingers knotting together in her lap. It was my grandmother. She taught it to me. Judge Finch didn't sit down. He stayed standing, his knuckles white where he gripped the edge of the table. Your grandmother, he repeated slowly, as if testing the words. What is her name? Chan Li Hua, Elena said. The familiar name felt strange in this formal, tense space. He shook his head, just a tiny movement. That wasn't the name he was listening for. Where does she live? Shanghai. She was a music teacher there. A flicker of something disappointment crossed his face, but the intense shock was still there, holding him upright. And this song, did she write it? No, Elena said, finding her voice a little more. She felt the need to explain, to fill this terrifying quiet. She said she learned it from a friend, a long time ago. Pen pal from America. They wrote letters and sent sheet music. This was a piece her friend composed. A gift. At the word composed, Judge Finch flinched, as if she'd touched a fresh wound. A pen pal, he murmured mostly to himself. His gaze drifted away from Elena, looking at some point in the air above the piano. The sharp, judging light in his eyes had gone soft and far away. Lydia, she always said. She had a friend in Shanghai, a teacher. They shared little compositions. The name Lydia hung in the air. It wasn't a name Elena knew, but the way he said it, with a tenderness that seemed to crack his stern voice open, told her everything. This was personal. Deeply, painfully personal. Mrs. Alvarez, the head of the department, gently intervened. Alistair? Perhaps we should. This is highly unusual. She gestured slightly to the other competitors waiting, to the broken protocol of the competition. He didn't seem to hear her. His eyes snapped back to Elena. Play it again, he said. It wasn't a command from a judge. It was a request from a drowning man. Elena glanced at Professor Lint, who gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. It was permission. She turned back to the piano. This time, it was different. Before, she had played for herself, a private act of defiance. Now, she was playing for him. The weight of that was immense. She took a breath, trying to find the quiet place inside where the song lived. She began again. The same gentle notes, the same sighing bass line. But now, knowing he was listening not to her technique, but to a ghost, she played with even more care. She tried to play it exactly as her grandmother had, with that same feeling of a comforting hand in the dark dot as she played. She watched him from under her eyelashes. He slowly sank back into his chair. He didn't pick up his pen. He just sat, motionless, his eyes closed. A single clear tear escaped from under his eyelid and traced a path down his lined cheek. He didn't wipe it away. He just let it fall in that moment. He wasn't Judge Alistair Finch, the terror of the conservatory. He was just a man, old and alone, listening to a love song from a life that was gone. When she finished the second time, the silence was different, softer, full of a shared understanding that nobody in the room fully understood, but everyone could feel. He opened his eyes. They were red-rimmed but clear. He looked at Elena, really looked at her for the first time. The second phrase, he said, his voice still rough but quieter now. The left hand, before the rise. It's a dotted rhythm. You play it evenly. Elena blinked. He was correcting her. After all that? My grandmother. She always played it that way, she said, a bit defensively. A small, sad smile touched the corner of his mouth. It was a strange, fragile thing on his usually severe face. I know. Lydia wrote it that way too, in her first draft. But she changed it. She said the dotted rhythm made it sound like a heartbeat. A hesitant, hopeful heartbeat. He hummed it, very softly, tapping the rhythm with a finger on the table. Asterisk de dum. Dash 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 dum dot asterisk. It was a tiny difference. A barely there syncopation. But as he hummed it, Elena could hear it. The song suddenly had a pulse. It was alive in a new way. She called it Lydia's lullaby, he said, the words leaving him in a long breath, as if he'd been holding them in for a decade. She wrote it for me, when I couldn't sleep. Too many thoughts, too much noise in my head from touring, from the critics. He trailed off, lost again. She would play it in the evening, in our apartment. Just like that? Just like that. He looked around the vast, formal hall, as if seeing the ghost of a cozy room with a single lamp and a well-loved piano superimposed over it. This was not the place for that song. And yet, here it was. I have not heard it, he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, since she died. 10 years ago. I thought it was gone. I couldn't even remember how it started. I tried once, and I couldn't. It was just silence. The confession left him hollowed out. The other judges were respectfully looking down at their papers. The competitors in the hall were utterly still. The competition had completely vanished. There was only this story, unfolding in the quiet. Elena felt a lump rise in her own throat. The angry, robotic Shostakovich felt 1,000,000 miles away. This was real. This was a connection, thin as a thread across an ocean and across years, but humming with a truth that her perfect notes had never touched. My grandmother, she said softly, wanting to give him something back, a piece of the puzzle. She treasured it. She said it was a song for when the world is too loud. She played it when she was sad, or when I was upset as a little girl. It was our secret song. He nodded, absorbing this. His pen pal, his Lydia, had sent her private lullaby across the world, and it had become a secret comfort in a home in Shanghai. It had soothed a little girl he would never meet. The beauty of that, the sheer unlikely wonder of it, seemed to slowly fill the hollow space inside him. He finally looked at his fellow judges, as if remembering where he was. He saw the clock, the schedule, the reality of the day waiting to restart. The competition. Mrs. Alvarez began gently. Judge Finch held up a hand. He turned back to Elena. The tear streak had dried on his cheek. You will not be judged on the second piece, he stated. His professional voice was trying to come back, but it was layered now with something else. It was outside the parameters. Elena nodded. She had known that. She didn't care. But for the Shostakovich, he continued, and she braced herself for the familiar criticism. He paused, choosing his words with a new, careful weight. You played the notes. All the right ones. You are a diligent, capable technician. He took a breath. But music is not just the notes on the page. It is the life between them, the silence between the beats, the reason for the melody. He glanced at the piano, as if he could still hear the ghost of the lullaby there. You found that reason in the second piece. You must now learn to find it in the first. To play not just with your fingers, but with that. He gestured vaguely toward her, toward the echo of the feeling she had just conjured. It wasn't a scolding. It was an instruction. The first real constructive thing he had ever said to her. The competition will continue, he announced to the hall, his voice regaining some of its authority. But it was quieter now, softer. He looked at the stage manager. We will take a short recess. 10 minutes. As the other judges stood, and people began to murmur and move, he didn't leave the table. He sat there, staring at the empty stage. Elena gathered her things, her mind buzzing. She walked off stage, past the other competitors who looked at her with a mixture of awe and curiosity. She didn't see them. She was thinking about a woman named Lydia, a dotted rhythm like a heartbeat, and a judge who had just shown a room full of people that even the sternest walls can have cracks. And through those cracks, music can still find a way to flow. The recess felt like stepping out of a deep emotional ocean and onto the hard, bright shore of everyday life. In the hallway outside the auditorium, the fluorescent lights buzzed. Competitors huddled in small groups, their whispered conversations a blur of nervous energy about keys and tempos and missed trills. The air smelled of old building and coffee from a vending machine. Elena stood alone by a tall window, pressing her forehead against the cool glass. Her mind was reeling. The judge's tear-streaked face was seared into her memory. The name Lydia echoed in her thoughts. She felt shaky, like she'd run a long distance without knowing where the finish line was. Elena. She turned. Professor Lint was there, her usual brisk manner softened by concern. She placed a hand lightly on Elena's arm. That was extraordinary and very brave. But are you all right? Elena nodded, not quite trusting her voice. I think so. I didn't know. None of us did, Professor Lint said, her voice low. I've known Alistair Finch for 20 years. I have never, ever seen him like that. Not even at his wife's funeral. He was composed then. A pillar of stone. She shook her head, a look of wonder on her face. That song. It unlocked something. Before Elena could respond, a figure appeared at the end of the hallway. It was Judge Finch himself. He had washed his face. His silver hair was neatly combed again. But he looked older somehow. The stern lines of his face seemed deeper, but not from anger. From a tired kind of sadness. He held himself with his usual straight posture, but it seemed like an effort now. A coat he had put back on. He walked directly toward them. The other students in the hallway fell silent, melting away like mist, giving him a wide berth. He stopped in front of Elena. He didn't look at Professor Lint. His eyes, still a bit red-rimmed, were fixed on Elena with a new, intense focus. Miss Chon, he began, his voice formal but lacking its former ice. There is a small conference room down the hall. Would you join me for a moment? There are things I would like to know. Professor Lint gave Elena's arm a slight, encouraging squeeze before letting go. I'll be right here, she murmured. Elena just nodded again, following the judge as he turned and walked. His steps were measured, slower than his usual brisk pace. He led her to a plain door, opened it, and held it for her. The small room held a table and a few chairs. A forgotten mug sat on a filing cabinet. It was deeply ordinary, a stark contrast to the drama of the last half hour. He closed the door. The sounds of the hallway were muffled. For a moment, he just stood by the window, his back to her, looking out at the conservatory's brick courtyard. "Please, sit," he said, not turning around. She pulled out a chair and sat. Her hands folded tightly on the table. He turned finally and sat across from her. He didn't sit at the head of the table, but directly opposite her. It made the space feel smaller, more intimate. "Chen Li Hua," he said, testing the name again. She was the music teacher, Lydia's friend. It wasn't really a question. He was putting the pieces together in his mind. "Yes," Helena said. "She doesn't write letters much anymore. Her eyes are not so good. But she has a box. A wooden box with old letters and sheet music. That song was in there, handwritten, in English, but with little notes from my grandmother in Chinese in the margins." A small, almost invisible tremor went through his hands where they rested on the table. Do you have it? The manuscript?" "No," Helena said, seeing the immediate flash of disappointment in his eyes. "It's in Shanghai, in her apartment. But I have a picture." She fumbled for her phone, her fingers clumsy. She scrolled through her photos, pictures of her cat, of friends, of sheet music, until she found it. A photo she'd taken last summer to help her learn the song. She turned the screen toward him. He leaned forward, and for the first time, she saw his hands shake visibly. He took the phone from her gently, as if it were made of glass. He stared at the image dot. It showed a page of handwritten music. The notes were drawn with a flowing, elegant hand. At the top, in the same ink, were the words, "Asterisk, for Li Hua, a little lullaby for quiet nights. From your friend, Lydia." Asterisk. He stared at it for a long, long time. His breath hitched. He zoomed in on the handwriting, tracing the shape of the letters on the screen with a trembling finger. "That's her," he whispered, a world of love and loss in the two words. "That's her hand. I'd know it anywhere." He handed the phone back, his movement slow. He looked at Elena, and his gaze was different. It was no longer the look of a judge assessing a student. It was the look of someone seeing a bridge to the past, and she was standing on the other end of it. "Tell me," he said, his voice husky. "Tell me about your grandmother. What is she like?" So Elena talked. She told him about Nai's patience, her laugh that sounded like wind chimes, how she could make any child feel calm. She described the small, sunlit apartment filled with plants and the smell of jasmine tea. She talked about the rainy afternoon she learned the song, and how her grandmother had said the American woman who sent it had a gentle soul, but a lonely music. At that, Judge Finch closed his eyes for a moment. She was lonely sometimes, he admitted, speaking to the memory in the room. "When I was away on tour for too long," she said, "the music kept her company. She would compose little things, and she would share them." He opened his eyes. "I never knew she shared them so far away." He began to ask questions, each one pulling a thread from the past. Did her grandmother ever mention Lydia's piano? She had a beautiful old Steinway, which made him nod slowly. Did she mention she had a dog? A scruffy terrier named Bertie, which brought the ghost of a smile to his face. Did she ever send anything back? A silk scarf, which Lydia had worn for years. The conversation was no longer an interrogation. It was a sharing. He told her small things, too. That Lydia hated the cold, loved the smell of rain on pavement, that she hummed constantly when she was cooking. He spoke in short, simple sentences, each one a tiny, precious artifact he was brushing off and holding up to the light. Helena listened, utterly captivated. The terrifying Judge Finch was gone. In his place was a storyteller, sharing the biography of a heart. After a while, the silence settled between them again, but it was a comfortable silence now. full of the stories they had just exchanged. He looked down at his hands, then back at her. "The competition," he said, returning reluctantly to the present. "We should discuss it." Elena's stomach tightened. The real world rushed back in. "Your performance of the Shostakovich," he said, and she braced for the familiar critique. But it didn't come. He spoke thoughtfully. "It was technically secure, but it was a shell. You played the composer's instructions, but not his. His joke. His dark little joke." He leaned forward. "Do you know why it felt empty?" "Because I was afraid," Elena said softly, surprising herself with the honesty. "I was afraid of getting it wrong. Of what people would think." He nodded, as if this was the correct answer. "Fear is the lock. The music is the key, but you must use it to unlock something inside you, not just the piano." He paused. "The lullaby. You were not afraid to play that. Why?" "Because it wasn't for a grade," she said simply. "It wasn't to be judged. It was just to feel something. To remember my grandmother." "Exactly," he said, a spark of his old intensity returning, but it was warmer now. "Directed. That is the task. You must find a way to make the Shostakovich about something for you. Not about impressing judges. Find the feeling in it. The slyness, the wink. Even if it's a small feeling. Even if you have to imagine it's a lullaby for a restless, complicated child. But it must be your reason." He was teaching her. Really teaching her. Not cutting her down, but showing her how to build herself up. "The scores from today will stand," he said, his tone returning to its official cadence. "You will likely not advance to the final round based on your first piece. The rules are the rules." Elena nodded. She had known this. It didn't sting the way she thought it would. "However," he continued, and he held her gaze, "if you are willing, I would like to hear you play again. Not in competition. In a master class. Next week. I would like to see if you can take what you found in that lullaby and bring it to life elsewhere." It wasn't an offer of favoritism. It was an offer of work. Hard, specific, demanding work. But it was an opportunity she had never dreamed of having. "Yes," Elena said immediately, her voice firm. "I would like that very much." He gave a single firm nod. "Good." He stood up, signaling the end of their meeting. He walked to the door, then paused, his hand on the knob. He didn't look back at her, but he spoke to the door. "Thank you," he said, the words quiet but clear. "For playing her song, and for the picture." Then he opened the door and stepped back into the hallway, the imposing figure of Judge Finch once more, but irrevocably changed. Elena stayed seated for a moment longer, the air in the small room still humming with the echoes of Lydia's lullaby and the beginning of a new, unexpected understanding. The results were posted on the bulletin board 2 days later. Elena's name was not on the list for the final round. She stood in front of the typed sheet, surrounded by the quiet murmurs of others, some sighing with relief, some with disappointment, and felt a surprising calm. She had known it would be this way. The score for her Shostakovich, however high or low it was, had been decided before she ever played the lullaby. The rules, as Judge Finch had said, were the rules. Everything was different. For the next week, she practiced with a new kind of focus. It wasn't the frantic, fearful drilling from before. It was slower, more curious. She would play a phrase from the Shostakovich, then stop. Asterisk, what is this? She would ask herself. Asterisk, is it a whisper? A stumble? A secret being told? She thought about Judge Finch's words. A dark little joke. She listened to recordings, not to copy, but to hear the laughter hidden in the sharp staccato notes. She even tried playing a line as if it were part of the lullaby, slow and sad, just to see how it changed. It was like she had been given a new set of ears. The day of the masterclass arrived. It was held in a smaller recital hall, not the huge, intimidating auditorium. The seats were filled with other piano students, all there to watch and learn. Judge Finch sat in the front row, a notebook on his lap. He looked like himself again, serious, composed, but his eyes held a watchful patience that hadn't been there before. Elena was the third student to play. When her turn came, she walked to the piano. Her stomach fluttered, but it wasn't the old freezing terror. It was the nervous energy of having something to say, and hoping you could say it right. She played the Shostakovich. From the very first notes, it was different. It wasn't perfect. In fact, in the middle of a very fast run, her finger slipped, and a wrong note clanged out, harsh and obvious. A few weeks ago, that mistake would have spiraled her into panic, ruining everything that came after. But this time, she didn't freeze. She leaned into it. She made the next note a little louder, a little more pointed, as if the mistake had been a character in the joke, tripping over its own feet. She kept going. She played with dynamics she hadn't dared before, sudden, shocking pianissimos that made the audience lean in, old fortissimos that weren't just loud, but angry and playful at once. She found the slyness. It wasn't in every note, but it was there. In the way she hesitated before a chord, or clipped a short note with a hint of cheat dot when she finished. The room was quiet for a beat, then filled with genuine, warm applause. It wasn't the polite patter from the competition. It was appreciative. Judge Finch stood and walked to the stage. He stood beside the piano, looking at her, then at the audience. "Better," he said, and the single word felt like a trophy to Elena. "You are beginning to listen. You are beginning to think." The mistake, he pointed to the spot where she had slipped. You used it. You made it part of the conversation. That is musicianship. It is not about avoiding errors. It is about continuing the story, even with a stumble. He then worked with her, right there in front of everyone. But his corrections were not scalpels meant to cut her down. They were tools. "This passage," he said, pointing to the music, "it is not just fast. It is gossiping. Can you make it sound like gossip? Quick, light, a little mean?" He demonstrated, his old hands moving with a fluid grace that belied his age, the notes tumbling out like whispered secrets. Elena tried. Her first attempt was clumsy. He stopped her. "No, listen. The tone. Use the very tips of your fingers, like you're tapping someone's shoulder to tell them a rumor." She tried again. It was better. He nodded dot for 20 minutes. He guided her, not by yelling, but by asking questions. What is the emotion here? Why does the left hand do that? He was teaching her how to think, not just how to play. When her time was up, he gave a final nod. Work on the gossiping. And remember, the silence before the final chord is the most important note in the piece. Make us wait for it. Make us want it. She returned to her seat, her mind buzzing, her heart full. She had played wrong notes, and he had praised her. The world had turned upside down. After the master class, as students milled about, he approached her. He held a small, thick envelope in his hands. "Miss Chun," he said, "a request and an exchange." He handed her the envelope. Inside were a few sheets of music paper, photocopied and slightly yellowed. They were handwritten compositions. Short preludes, a little waltz. At the top of one, it said asterisk, for AF, when the city is too loud. Asterisk, these were Lydia's, he said, his voice low. Other little things she wrote. I thought, perhaps your grandmother might like to see them. To know that the conversation went both ways. Elena looked at the graceful handwriting, so similar to the lullaby. It was a treasure. She would love this, she whispered, touched beyond words. "And my request," he continued. "You said your grandmother has a box with letters. If it is not too much trouble, if she would be willing, I would be grateful for copies of anything from Lydia. I have my own, of course, but I never had the other side of the story." Elena understood. He didn't just want relics of his wife. He wanted to see her through her friend's eyes. He wanted the full picture of the woman he loved. "I will ask her," Elena said. "I know she will say yes." A look of profound gratitude passed over his face, so raw it was almost hard to look at. He simply nodded. Over the following months, a slow, careful exchange began. Elena's grandmother, once she understood through a long, emotional video call, was overjoyed. She had her grandson help scan every letter, every note in the margins of the sheet music. Elena would send digital files to Judge Finch. He, in turn, would send back scanned copies of Lydia's letters from his own collection. Elena became the bridge. She would sometimes sit with Judge Finch in his studio after school, not for regular lessons, but for what he called consultations. They would talk about music, but also, sometimes, about the letters. He would read a line aloud, his voice softening. Asterisk, Li Hua. The maple tree outside my window is the color of fire today. It makes the sad piece I'm working on feel warmer. Asterisk, and he would smile, a real quiet smile. She loved that tree, he'd say. He was still a demanding teacher. He could still be sharp, impatient with carelessness. But the cruel, personal edge was gone. The judgment was about the work, not the worth of the person. And Elena learned. She learned more about music from him than from anyone else, because he was teaching her to connect it to life, to memory, to weather, to a feeling in your chest. One afternoon, weeks later, she was practicing the lullaby in an empty practice room. She played it with the dotted rhythm he had taught her, the heartbeat rhythm. The door opened, and he stood there, listening. He didn't come in. He just leaned against the doorframe, his eyes closed. When she finished, he opened them. "You play it well," he said. "You have your grandmother's touch, and a little of hers." He didn't say Lydia's name, but he didn't need to. "But it is your own too. That is how it should be." He turned to leave, then paused. "The Shostakovich is ready for the end-of-term recital. Play it like you're telling that gossip to a friend. And remember the silence before the final chord." The harsh judge who had cut off her rehearsal was gone. In his place was a man who carried a great loss, but who had been reminded, by a simple, brave act, that love could echo in the most unexpected ways. He was not softened, but he was remade. More human. And Elena? She learned that technique was just the door. The real music happened when you had the courage to walk through it, bringing your whole self, your memories, your fears, your grandmother's songs with you. She learned that sometimes breaking the rules to play your true note can change more than just a score. It can change a life. 2 lives, maybe more. And the music, once set free, never really stops. It just finds new ears to hear it.